In this episode, we speak with Dr Paul Bertsch, Deputy Director of Science of the new Land and Water Business Unit at the CSIRO. Wastewater-based epidemiology approaches, that's to detect COVID-19 in wastewater, are being implemented worldwide as an environmental surveillance approach to inform health authority decision making. Dr Bertsch's team, flushed with success, are at the forefront of developing more accurate tests for COVID-19 in wastewater in Australia. Dr Bertsch, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Look, can you tell us about the tests for COVID-19 in wastewater? Do they require further development, and can you explain what the tests tell us and what they don't tell us?
Yeah, sure, Mike. The testing wastewater for viruses or even chemicals is an area called wastewater-based epidemiology, and it's actually been practiced in many countries for viruses and other diseases for many, many years, and in fact, decades. And what we're doing around SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, is actually looking for specific gene fragments of the virus, so it's a molecular fingerprint. And so we collect the wastewater, we concentrate the virus, we extract the genetic material, which in this case is RNA. This virus has an RNA-encoded genome instead of DNA. And then we use a process that's very similar to what many of your viewers would be aware of in these crime scene investigation shows, where you process that genetic material and put it in a machine that's really a molecular photocopier, and you make millions, up to 1 billion copies of the gene, so that you can actually determine that it is present or not in the sample.
Do you have the same issues that's been associated with PCR test performed on people, and how accurate are they, and how do you avoid false positives?
Well, we do. You can imagine wastewater being a much more complex media than humid fluids. And so there's actually quite a bit more involved in terms of getting around some of the potential problems. But yeah, it's really about good laboratory control and workflows, QA/QC protocols, but it also goes all the way back to sampling. And so sampling in the field, much like the human testing as well, some of the early false positives were just due to sampling errors and cross-contamination. So again, this is a bit more challenging in a way because you're sampling wastewater, transporting it to a lab, and then processing it. And so, yeah, there are potentials certainly for false positives. But if you have well-trained personnel and as I mentioned, the workflows and the QA/QC protocol, false positives aren't really a problem. What's more troubling is false negatives.
Why would that be?
Well, so the false negatives is because wastewater is quite complex, and it does go, as I mentioned, to the sampling. So we've looked at different sampling methods, for example, and found that having to integrate sampling over a 24-hour period is pretty critical to get a reasonable sample. But oftentimes, some of the testing testing authorities are just going out and taking what's known as a grab sample. So just going out and dipping a sampler into the wastewater. So they're taking a single sample, and we find that's quite unreliable. And then all the way through to processing the material. So concentrating the virus, for example, we've optimized those methods, and we've been able to increase the efficiency of capture of the virus up to about 67%. But there are methods being used around the world that are only 2% efficient. And so you can imagine then, if you're at a low concentration already, if you have just taken a grab sample, which is going to be quite variable and oftentimes not nearly as sensitive as a integrated sample over time, then all of those things really add up, Mike, to where you can get these false negatives when the virus is actually present in wastewater. So it is tricky, but there are ways to use the best protocol that are available globally. And there's a global collaboration that's going on that's quite active in terms of continually improving methods. And our folks in CSIRO are at the forefront of developing those.
We hear, and it's becoming a little more regular than I would like, we hear of these samples being taken in various locales, such as in Townsville in Queensland and Rockhampton and the Gold Coast, and you start to fear that it may be politicised, that it's going to become a lockdown or whatever the government would like to do. How accurate, though, are you pinpointing, getting the right location of these carriers, and is this, cause for concern?
Well, so there's another positive test that some people call false positive. We wouldn't, and that is individuals that recover continue to shed the virus. They shed the virus at relatively low levels, and it's most likely that they're not infectious. But we have evidence now from an individual in Cairns, where we were getting positives for some time, that individual actually tested positive in a clinical test 8 weeks after they had recovered. And it turns out that they weren't positive, but the nasal pharyngeal swab, which is the one that they oftentimes give to humans, came up positive. And then it came up negative the next day. But it was clear that individual was shedding the virus, even though they were recovered and not infectious. And we were likely picking up their signature in the wastewater. And so we can also get an idea about the relative intensity, how much is out there. So, for example, as we looked through February and March, our wastewater results tracked very well with clinical data. And so what you're really trying to do with this test is get those early warning detection. And you'll know here in Queensland, the chief health officer talks about those positives and mentions that it could be someone that's recovered. We don't know. There's no need for fear at this stage, but it does raise awareness, and they do then set up pop-up testing stations and really request that people go and get tested if they're showing any symptoms. Because one of the problems right now, Mike, for us here in Australia more generally, but certainly here in Queensland, is complacency. And as you've seen, these outbreaks can occur very, very quickly and spread very rapidly, especially with these new variants. And so it's really important to get it early and have the reasonable public health response.
Interesting you mentioned the complacency thing. I totally agree with you. Go back 6 weeks ago, maybe 8 weeks ago, and everywhere you walked there was hand sanitizer, and there was this, so many in the store, and or so many in the entertainment venue. And I can tell you now that's just gone out of the window. Even at gyms, there used to be wiping down and all this sort of stuff. It's almost stopped, and that complacency bit, whether it's just a Queensland thing that she'll be right, mate, or whether we've become immune to the information that's been pumped out to us from government and from other authorities. So you're dead right about the complacency. What do you feel about that? Do you think we need to just sort of kickstart ourselves and get back into being, cleaning our hands and making sure we're 1.5 meters away if we can, and just little things?
Yes, I think we're going to be managing this for some time, Mike, and we're going to have to continue to remember to practice those good hygiene practices, as well as social distancing whenever possible. And yeah, I mean, I think the complacency risk is quite large, and I find that Queensland Health uses the wastewater data just to continue to use to raise that awareness. The virus is circulating in the community. At this stage, it's likely low levels. It may not be an individual that's contagious within the community, but please, be aware that you need to practice good hygiene and get tested if you have even very mild symptoms. Because one of the things that one of the powers of wastewater-based epidemiology is that we know that individuals that are pre-symptomatic, that is, haven't yet displayed symptoms even though they're infected, or more importantly, those that are asymptomatic. And the percent of individuals that are asymptomatic, that is, individuals that never show symptoms, is quite high. So it ranges between 40 and 60% globally, and so that's a high number. So you have people in the community that could be spreading the the virus that causes COVID-19, and not even know that they're doing that, of course. And again, the wastewater signal would emerge, and we would know, and we could pinpoint where that was happening, and take the appropriate public health intervention actions in that specific area.
What's the frequency and number of tests done so far in Australia?
Mike, I don't know over all of Australia because there's differences in testing in the different jurisdictions. So some states, as you know, like Queensland, Victoria, and New South Wales, are actually posting their data online. Others aren't. And so it's really difficult for me to give you a view of all of Australia. But since we are working quite closely with Queensland Health, I can tell you that they're measuring 42 wastewater treatment plants on a regular basis, twice a week, and that covers 70% of the population of Queensland. So it's quite significant, and to date we've run well over 1,000 samples, and we continue to increase the frequency and as well as the number based on Queensland Health's appetite of even going to individual assets such as prisons, for example, or smaller communities, and we are in the process of developing some test methods that could actually be passive, which would be much easier in remote areas, for example.
Fascinating. Yet another weapon in the fight against COVID-19. It's good to know that the Queensland government and the CSIRO, that our business is your business, so to speak. Paul, thank you very much for your time, and all the best.
Thank you, Mike.
In India, we dig deeper into a tragedy that occurred recently in northern India, where a part of a glacier broke off, triggering a massive flood, washing away parts of 2 hydropower plants and other infrastructure, and leaving 50 lives lost and over 150 feared dead. While some climate experts rushed to declare this a climate change event from rising temperatures, rational observers point to other causes, including construction of back-to-back dams and a rush for renewable energy projects that may have destabilised the fragile environment in the Himalayas. Sanjeev Ahluwalia is an advisor at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. Sanjeev, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Great to see you and to be here with you in your studio.
Now, can you give us an update of the damage and lives lost by the glacier break in Uttarakhand? As
disasters go, in terms of human lives, of course, even a single human life gone is a life wasted. It's a terrible agony. But the human loss has been limited. And most of them were actually workers who were working on these 2 hydro plants which have been affected. So what they've found is about 58 bodies, corpses, and it is suspected that another 140 odd people are missing, which could include villagers, a few villagers who might have been swept away by the great flood that happened after this slab, this sort of massive slab, overhanging slab of a glacier just came crashing down into the river, creating a huge sort of a tidal wave, 15 to 20 meters high, in places where the gorge is narrow. These gorges tend to be very narrow. So even with a relatively small amount of water, the tidal force becomes pretty extreme. And this was quite violent.
In your article, you say it's unclear if the large number of projects and rush for growth may have caused the disaster. Can you give us an idea of the nature and scale of the projects being built in the area?
Well, in the area of this particular riverine area, which is the Alaknanda area, the total area is roughly around 7,000 or 8,000 square kilometers, and there are about 13 projects which are functioning or are about to be functioning, and there are another about 14 odd locations where projects might come up in future. Though I must tell you, Mike, that we're actually sort of trying to close the stable door, after the horse is bolted, because hydropower development has really been overtaken by the technological developments in solar power. So if you want to go for renewable energy, I think most people would be looking more at solar power today because of the great push given by our present government, which is Mr. Modi's government, rather than go into all the complexities of hydropower and the fact that you have interface issues with communities, you have problems with flooding like we just saw, and it's a clunky development as compared to hydropower, which is easy to put up and gives decent returns. So I think there aren't going to be very many new projects coming up, and also a little bit of history out here. Out of these 20 odd projects, future and proposed and current, and only about 5 or 6 projects are large ones, which are in the region of 400 megawatts each, or at least more than 100 megawatts. Most of the others are small ones, each one generating no more than 25 megawatts. And the history of this actually dates back to 1990s, because that's when if you remember, the Rio summit happened in 1992. And as a consequence of that, large dams came under huge criticism. There was a World Commission of Dams which was set up in 1994 or thereabouts. And the results were very adverse. And as a result of this, the World Bank pulled out of dam financing. And so we had a huge project in India going on. The Sardar Sarovar was also called the Narmada Sagar Dam, and they pulled out of it. So this dam, which was started in 1961, actually wasn't completed till 2017, just about 3 years ago. So, after about the 90s, large dams became unpopular and on environmental and ecological grounds. So the Holy Grail became small hydropower because they were easier to put up and find locations for, and they were relatively innocuous in terms of ecological disturbance. So that is why, in the last, 30 odd years, there's been a proliferation of these small hydro plants in our search for clean power. But I think solar in the last 10 years has gone tremendously ahead, particularly because of technological developments, which are continuing. And I think small hydro has kind of had its day.
By building these dams and relying on hydro, I think the Supreme Court, after the 2013 flood, they sort of banned any new dams because it can make landscape more unstable. This, I would imagine, is where solar comes into it, because solar is basically just the building of large panels. So does this already make the dams old news?
Well, Mike, we need to distinguish between, not all hydropower is run via dams. I mean, we have what's called run-of-river hydropower, which essentially means that, you tap the water at a higher level, pipe it down to a lower level, and run the turbine through the pipe. And so you don't really have a dam in the classic sense. You don't have a Gordon Dam, for instance, behind the hydropower. What you do have is a rush of water coming down in a turbine through a pipe. And one of these pipes is actually where most people, while constructing the pipe, got caught. And at the end of that is a turbine. So the Supreme Court, the verdict is versus dams. And yes, I don't think there are any large dams that are going to probably come up in the future. And as you correctly assess, in any ways, if you're looking for green power, solar is a better way to go. Though, mind you, Nepal is still constructing, our friends to the north are still constructing big hydro. And so there is, what we're trying to do is trying to network, South Asia into one grid, so that wherever there's hydro potential, whether it's in Nepal or maybe in Arunachal Pradesh at a future date, wherever power is generated, what's important is to, feed in clean power to those who want it. So we're trying to develop a South Asian grid, which will help us do that. So a little more flexibility there on hydro. We can kind of outsource, hydro to our friends in Nepal who are better placed to produce it. And we could look at solar, and we could look at other things that come up in future.
Are these projects then a combination of government and private projects, and are many supported by large government subsidies? I mean, for example, we talk about solar. Solar truly is the one that makes the most sense, because you've got a fair amount of sunshine in India, and it just seems like a lay down misere almost that this is the way it should go.
Yes, but in solar, for instance, the costs have have crashed. Costs of equipment. So in actual fact, today it's fairly competitive, even without a big subsidy. And same is the case really with small hydro. See, large dams are different, because large dams are multiple purpose dams. Don't forget that we still need drinking water, right? You have to trap drinking water somewhere. Cities are growing. India is very under-urbanized. By 2040, we're probably going to be, taking another 500 million people into cities, and they're going to come in anyway. They are coming, but they don't find place to live today. And water is scarce. So you can't completely do away with the concept of dams, though you have to think of it rationally, whether you need more smaller dams which have less of an impact or whatever. There are lots of options out there, depending also on the ecology of the particular location. But we have to think seriously about drinking water. And in India, because we, 45 odd % of our population lives off agriculture, believe it or not. There's still an agriculture. We have to think of water, irrigation for that particular for agriculture. So I think a great deal of more thought has to go into the sequestering of water in appropriate ways, and also its distribution, but most importantly on its pricing, and the incentives that are available to people today to use it well. Government has started a program. We are very impressed by Israel, because they use water extremely well. Kind of they made the desert bloom, and they've done it using technology. So I think those attempts are also on to use technology, not just in drip irrigation, but also in forecasting when the land needs water, so that you don't over irrigate. So all this is it's a messy landscape, as always, but I think there's a lot of activity going on, and it's all in the right direction. That's the good news.
Just quickly, renewables in India, plenty of sunshine. I would imagine there are some gentle breezes here and there for the windmills. We saw what happened in Texas when they relied on the renewables there. It froze, and so they have no energy. What are in India, if you were to go down the renewable path, such as solar and the turbines, what are some of the unseens that we don't hear of that may place those renewables in jeopardy?
The good news, Mike, is that we're very far from, reaching the tipping point. Places like Germany, for instance, 60% of their power comes from renewables, right? So we are in kind of the high double digits, so about 15 to 20% of our power is generated from new renewables. And so we're very far from a tipping point which people generally take to be 40. And that is what the national plan is, that by 2030 we should at least have 40% of the power coming to us from renewable sources. Also, unlike in Texas, which is a very rich place, India still remains a fairly poor country. And though there is a top layer of 1% or 10% of Indians who are very rich, I mean, who could be rich even in Brisbane or wherever, or in Melbourne, but there is the bottom two quintiles. 40% of Indians live a pretty scratchy existence. India still needs a great deal of power, and we're going to be using all types without neglecting any particular source that we have. And I would actually go to the extent of including coal in that, which is dirty fuel, no doubt. But we have no gas, and it's very expensive to import it. Lots of price fluctuations. We're still a very poor country, and very poorly electrified. If I may point out, that's a very important thing. Our per capita consumption of electricity is extremely low, and so it has to go up if we are to live in the modern world. And so energy development in India is going to be multifocal, for a significant amount of time. But we are very conscious of the fact that, we must add as much clean energy to the basket as we can. We are helped by the fact that battery technology has improved considerably, and is hopefully going to become even better in future, particularly because you have all these fancy cars from Tesla and all coming in, So battery technology is going to really take off over the next 10 years, which means that some of the problems with renewables would actually go away, because you would then be able to generate power from solar power and then store it. And during nighttime, just draw it from, and you have a huge big Tesla in Australia. You have a massive battery farm operating. I don't know whether it's experimental or operational, but it seems to be doing quite well. So I think renewables, so-called new renewables, are soon going to become old renewables, and they're going to acquire characteristics very similar to what more traditional energy forms already have, which is reliability, predictability, and so on.
To achieve these goals and projects, to make them happen, would it be more of a investment from overseas or private investment within India, or would it be a combination of government and private?
Are we referring here to power, electric power?
Yes, to energy, say solar and turbines and hydro.
Yes, Mike, electric power, strangely, it's none of these. It's that our distribution utilities are predominantly still state government owned, and they're very badly managed. And as a result of that, they continually make losses. So they do not recover even the costs of providing electricity to the number of people that they do. And those people are going to increase in future. And because India is a poor country, our definition of lifeline supply is rather generous compared to the more traditional points of view. Because we're trying to actually provide electricity to people as a tool. And it's not just a tool, as we've seen, in the epidemic. It's even a tool for education, because if you don't have electricity, you can't charge your phones, you can't even attend lessons, right? So that sort of highlights how important electricity is in the modern world. And if you're looking at following a profession, there are many professions that you're cut out of if you don't have electricity. Mm-hmm. So I think that we need to do better on the distribution side. I hope the government in the budget has said that it would like to pursue a large privatization program. It's been said before, but we hope they mean it this time around. And if that happens, and if we privatize distribution in India more significantly than it is today, then there is hope that there would be higher efficiency, and that the end of the pipe would become a commercially viable option. Today it is not. So the problem here is not the lack of capacity. We have 35 gigawatts of gas sitting idle, because if we were to run them, the financial load on the distribution utilities would be higher, and they would go further into a loss. So it's an internal problem that we have to fix. That we have to fix the distribution utilities to work on a commercial basis, so that the electricity industry at the end of the pipe becomes a commercially viable operation. And if that were to happen, money would not be a problem at all to feed the industry. So that's where the problem lies. It's not an external problem, it's an internal problem. It's a domestic problem.
You mentioned, just briefly winding this up, you mentioned that by 2040 you expect the cities to have an extra 500 million people.
Yes.
How will the cities survive? What do they have to do to make it livable?
Yes, good question. Well, I mean, one is, if you actually look at Indian cities today, they're not the best planned cities in any way to start with. So it's not just the 500 million who are going to be arriving, but it's also that, let's say the 700 million people who may be living in a city of some form, how many of them are living in an appropriately, congenial condition? And, most of our cities, in some cities, 40% of the city is what we call a slum. In other words, it's totally unregulated development. And it's just people who've built anywhere, anything. Often sewage disposal is a problem. Delivery of water, clean water is a problem, and so on. So I think Indian cities, again, is an area which is sort of an area where deep thinking is required as to what exactly needs to be done to bring them around. And my feel is that, yet again, we have to make cities more egalitarian than they are. Cities today are predominantly driven by the predilections and the requirements of the elite, which is the top sort of 20% who live in cities. So those are the people that the city is actually catering to, and those are the people that the city is taxing. The other people are not even taxed, So I think this has to change, because I think the difference between agricultural, occupations and living, rural living and city living, is that there are more obligations on anybody who becomes a city citizen, if I may call him that, as they are on somebody who's, a farmer in a rural area. And paying tax and getting taxed being willing to pay tax is one of those things. Because unless and until we start planning for the bottom billion, this issue of dysfunctional cities, dysfunctional hospitals, dysfunctional regulations is not going to go away. This is a tough one, because we're not that old a country. You're not like, say, the United States with 200 odd history, just 75 years old, and we came from a bad place, in the sense that systematically the belief that every life is equal was drilled out of the country through the long colonial rule. And so while people empathize with this concept theoretically, that everybody is equal, the fact is everybody's not. We all know it. Most developing countries are really a coalition of elites who manage the place, and India is no different. And that's strictly not the way, a city can be managed unless you want to become like Rio, where there are battlefields within the city that police can't enter
It's
because of poverty and inequality. So I think these are issues that they're very deep issues, not easy to solve, particularly by politicians, who after all are elected people. And one could say that, well, I mean, the mass of the people who elect them are the dispossessed. So they should cater to them. That is true. But it's a resources issue when you try and handle it at the bottom of the pipe. So I think that it has to go slowly in India, a very, very large country with very different problems all around. It can't go fast, shouldn't go fast, and but we are getting there. There's no doubt about that, and I think there's no better example of that than the fact that for the first time in the history of India, a person whose dad used to just sell tea at a railway station has become prime minister. This is so unimaginable for a country like India, but it's happened. And so I think these are signs of change, and they're good signs of change. I think they're helpful signs of change. So I'm hopeful.
Well, we have this huge land mass in Australia and about 26 million people, and we have trouble. So I think I'll just let the politicians at this stage worry about and ponder the future. Sanjeev, it was a real pleasure. We have to do this again because there are so many issues to talk about, and maybe you and I can put our heads together and may not be the answer, but at least we're on the right track for a better life.
Absolutely, Mike. You and I are going to change the world.
Well, maybe not, but you might. Sanjeev, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And finally, the Australian federal government agency Safe Work Australia says there is currently insufficient evidence about the impact of COVID-19 vaccines on transmission of the virus, which means that a worker could get COVID-19 even if they're vaccinated. Two questions. Does that mean that government has an excuse to lock down entire cities, states and countries whenever they feel the urge? And does that mean the vaccine doesn't work that well? I thought the idea of a vaccine was to enable us to return to normal, but I forget the magic word, the one that the left just love. Emergency. A health emergency or COVID emergency, a climate emergency, and if you dare disagree, then you'll be shut down. No reason, no discussion, no hope. I'm Mike Ryan.